Hello, you're watching Dialogue on CCTV News, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. We are talking about today two ancient civilizations' most recent interactions, China and India. In a relationship that stretches back to the beginning of the first millennium AD, the two countries started to exchange ideas and goods with the help of the emerging Silk Road. India even introduced Buddhism to China, while China exported silk and many other commodities to India, in addition to the historical exchanges of pilgrims, explorers, and traders. Today, they account together for nearly 40% of the world's population, and together they could soon dominate the world's economy. At least that's the prediction of the politicians and commentators on both sides of the Himalayas following a high-level visit by Chinese Premier Li Keqiang to India this week. The two sides apparently put border disputes to one side and focus on new trading relationships and diplomatic ties in what was described as a dance between the dragon and the elephant. As they say, it takes two to tango. So will this be a lasting partnership between the two? Or will they fall out of the steps against a backdrop of past distrust? To answer these questions, strategic questions, I'm joined in the studio by Mr. Hu Shisheng, who is the director of the South and Southeast Asian Study with China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Welcome to our program, sir. Hello. And also joining us in the studio, Professor Tao Wenzhao, Senior Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome as well. Later, we're also going to be joined by an Indian panelist. But before we go to a discussion, gentlemen, with all of you, let's take a look at this background report.
A handshake across the are two economies where there is a fair amount of space for catch-up, as they call it. The visit came just weeks after the standoff on the Indian-China border zone, which made the territorial dispute between the two sides another focus of attention.
Both Prime Minister Singh and I believe there are far more common interests than differences between our two sides. We need to confront issues with a broad mind and tackle them in a mature way.
The two Asian neighbours have agreed to improve the mechanism for settling the border issue and reiterated their commitment to maintaining peace and tranquility.
We agreed that our special representatives will meet soon to continue discussions seeking early agreement on a framework for a fair, reasonable and mutually acceptable boundary settlement.
During his three-day visit, Premier Li also had a meeting with the chief of the ruling Indian National Congress Party, Sonia Gandhi, and Indian Vice President Mohammed Hamid Ansari, and laid a wreath at the memorial of Mahatma Gandhi on Monday. Just as Premier Li said, in history the two civilizations have had uninterrupted and in-depth exchanges. Today, facing the future, the two neighbours see enormous potential for common development. Both sides hope that the seeds sowed today in spring will be harvested in autumn.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang's visit to India this week. We are joined once again by Mr. Hu Shisheng and Mr. Tao Wenzhao in the studio. I want to ask a directional question to begin our interview today. Will the two countries, China and India, diverge or converge? Mr. Hu.
It is not issue verge or converge or diverge. It is issue maybe more closely related to cooperation or not cooperation, because as the major powers, there have differences. It is quite natural phenomena. So, but we do not make the difference. Let the difference to disturb your cooperation. This is more important to the matter.
Mm-hmm. Professor Tao.
Well, I think they will converge, in spite of some difficulties and differences on the border issues, etc., because the two countries are ancient civilizations, and the two facing with a common issue, common challenge of economic development, and the two share a lot of identical or similar views on regional and international issues.
Having said that, though, about the border issue, that's probably the very first question jump into everybody's mind when talk about relations between China and India, and we should fairly handle that in our show today. What about the nature of this question? Can the two administrations now serving the two governments afford to make any compromise on the border issue? Are we going to see the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to discussions and debates about border issues?
The border issue, the basic point is that it is a highly politically sensitive issue. So it needs to give and take mutually. That is, before reaching a mutually acceptable settlement, they still need a long, long way to go, because this is too sensitive and it is not the right time for both governments to make meaningful concessions, especially to India, the coalition government. This kind of decisions will need the revision of their constitution, which need 2/3 of their revision. However, to China, we are under the public opinion pressure. So before reaching a fundamental agreement, they need more time to re-educate the people about the ground realities of the borders, and also at the same time to manage successfully, in a successful way, the crisis. It's just like the accident, like the face-off eventualities, which happened several days before. But now we have more mechanisms to address this kind of crisis.
Like what kind of mechanisms?
We have too many mechanisms, like the joint working groups, joint expert groups, like the special envoy, also like the border affairs consultation and coordination mechanism. We have also the hotline across the borders between the brigadier generals. So it is very, I think it is workable and functional for so many years. There is one miracle that ever since 1967, there's not one single bullet be shot across the border.
Right. I want to quote,
1967.
before we go to you, Professor Tao, I want to quote from the Chinese premier who just visited India. He said this: as long as we face the problem squarely, of course he's talking about the border issues, and talk to each other with sincerity, we'll eventually find proper solutions. But I want to ask you, even though the two countries are willing to work on it wholeheartedly, there might be, of course, bumps and challenges on the road of negotiations and discussions. That could be the times when there might be setbacks or serious setbacks of the bilateral relations. Can the two countries handle them maturely?
Well, I think the two sides fully realize the difficulty of solving the border issue. And so, as Professor Hu just mentioned, we have a lot of mechanisms to deal with it. And also, we have reached the political guidance for the solving border issue that neither side will use military means, will use the armed forces to handle that issue. Neither will threat the other with armed forces. Yeah. So I think it's difficult and it takes some time, and we must wait. But we are gradually, although slowly, approaching to the solution.
But border issue every time has been brought up by, let's just say, oppositions in the Indian politics, or in China, you might see it in the public opinions or newspapers and media. It is something being brought up always at the very beginning when it talks about the two countries' relations. So can the two countries really move forward and put aside this while discussing it in details?
Now, the two governments, of course, make remitting efforts in that direction. We see that in the past 10 years, we already make a big progress in 2005 that we have set up the political parameters for settling the border issues. That is, we already have a series of guiding principles to address the border issues.
Like
the next
what?
step, like that, to respect the historical feelings, to respect ethnic feelings, to respect the settlement of the population, to respect of the ground realities. These kind of principles we already set up. But the next stage is how to implement the principles, to change the principles into ground demarcations of the borders. But I think the next development could be to make each other to acknowledge their claimed LAC, mean line of actual control. If they acknowledge the LAC of the others, I think this kind of face-off eventualities, which happened several days before, will be reduced dramatically.
Well, let's move on. It's not just about the border issue discussions. It's also about how one of the two is seeing the other. where their visions are, what are their aspirations, what do they want to become, and eventually how would that reflected into the bilateral relations between the two countries. Mr. Tao, China, some say, believes a good relation with India would mean peaceful neighborhood, would mean the prevention of so-called establishing a anti-China circle around China, would mean good resource base, good market, and possible technical cooperation between the two countries. I wonder, do you think it's China's aspiration in terms of the nature of relations with India?
Well, I think China-India relationship is one of the most international, most bilateral relationship for China. And I still remember in 2003, Prime Minister Wen Jiabao invited the Indian Prime Minister Vajpayee to visit China, and the two prime ministers released a joint statement in which the two made very clear that neither view the other as a threat, and neither will pose a threat to the other. And that, I think, is a very important event for the two sides to improve their relations. Of course, 10 years has passed, and the bilateral relations between India and China has improved a lot, and we both are the important members of the BRICS,
Right.
and both, plays increasingly important role in the international
There are a
affairs.
lot of similarities
Yeah.
to be shared. However, China, I would wonder, Mr. Hu, is also might be aware of the approach made by the Indian side, for example, becoming friendlier towards some of China's neighbors, Japan, for example. The United States, of course, is another player in the Asia-Pacific region. Meanwhile, India is more aware of China's getting friendlier with countries such as Myanmar and Bangladesh, both of which consider as the backyard of their own periphery.
I think that both India and China are members of we call the Indo-Pacific regions, and both are rising giants or big major powers. So they have their own rights to make relations with all the countries in this region, even beyond. But one of the guiding principle is that they're not against each other. This is a strategic common ground for both of the leaders or successive governments that, unlike they're not posing threats to each other, that be sensitive and respect each other's security concern, especially security concern. I think India's diplomacy is very independent. Just like Prime Minister Manmohan Singh said in Durban that India will not be a tool. Yeah, that is true. We have that kind of trust. Yeah.
There has been a tradition in Indian politics
that is a
and
tradition,
diplomacy,
yeah.
in fact. And talking about that, we are also joined by Professor M.D. Nalapad from Manipal University in India. Professor Nalapad, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
What do you think, Professor Nalapad, of the aspirations the two countries have for themselves? And do you think those might be contradictory to one another, or rather be complementary to one another at this moment?
Well, I'd like to point out that when Prime Minister Lee last came to India 27 years ago, the Indian and Chinese economies were equal in size to each other. Today, China's economy is 4 times the size of India. That is the huge difference between India and China that has taken place in the last 3 decades. And therefore, many of us in India believe we have a lot to learn from China. And coming to the point about complementarity, the fact is that, in my view, it is inconceivable that India and China will fight another war with each other. The interests of the two countries are similar in most multinational fora, such as WTO, Climate Change Conference, UN, etc. That being the case, I believe that although there is a lot of talk about tension, and much of this talk is created by countries and by individuals who have a vested interest in ensuring that India and China remain far apart. The reality is that geopolitics and geoeconomics will bring India and China closer together.
Having said that, though, Professor, one might also see the realities in India. For example, you got forces in India that are pretty much pro-China. You also have some of those groups that are not necessarily friendly to China. For example, some would say the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Commerce in India are very much for China, creating a good environment for China investment. However, those who are related to so-called the national security might be having a second thought. And among the Indian elites, we also see different camps. What do you think is the general direction?
There's no doubt that you're right. And the reason for this is the fact that India and China have so few direct links with each other. Chinese media is hardly visible in India, and Indian media is hardly visible in China. Both of us learn about the other through third parties, and many of these third parties have a vested interest in keeping us apart. So the only way forward is, as Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Premier Lee correctly said, that institutions in the two countries, including the media, should now come together and tell the people about each other's country. The more people come to India, the more they'll realize India is not aggressive towards China.
Right.
The more one visits China, the more it will be realized that China is not aggressive towards India.
But Professor Nalapal, we see a pattern, I would say, about the bilateral relations. Whenever you got high-level officials from both sides visiting each other's countries, you have relatively warmer relations in the press, relatively warmer relations in the rhetoric, and also expressed by governments. However, when during ordinary times, that kind of warmth might be degraded a bit. Do you think that is the phenomenon you also observe? What is the way to really change that?
I think the way forward is very simple. The way forward is economics and people-to-people contact. If, for example, we have 1 million Chinese tourists visiting India and 1 million Indian tourists visiting China, learning about each other's country. If, for example, trade expands from $70 billion to $150 billion and more, I think all these negative voices are going to find themselves much more in trouble than is the case now. What we need is a greater expansion of people-to-people links, of culture, of transport, and of economics.
And certainly we're going to discuss about the economics and also the good relations between the two peoples. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back. You're watching live edition of Dialogue coming from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. With me in the studio, once again, we have Professor Tao Wenzhao, Senior Research Fellow with Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We're also joined in the studio by Mr. Hu Shisheng, Director of the South and Southeast Asian Studies with China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Earlier, gentlemen, we certainly had a debate with Professor Nalapal from India about the strategic relations between the two countries, China and India. Now let's go into some of the details. Benchmark 1, economics. Trade, of course, is the big issue. This time we see the two countries talk about the bilateral trade, mainly focusing on how to make sure it is more quote-unquote balanced, with China winning the favor earlier. Mr. Hu, can China afford, at this moment, particularly when the economy is slowing down, to provide too much gifts in terms of trade? In other words, cut, quote-unquote, the trade surplus with India much?
No, the trade deficit is an inner problem of India, or can say it is an endogenous problem of India. However, whatever China will do in the future, this kind of deficit or imbalance cannot be solved in the near future, because this is a structural contradiction
Explain,
within
please.
India. Such as that we know that this depends on the imbalance of the trade, especially in goods, depends on the exporting capacities, while exporting capacity is closely related to manufacturing sector's capacities, while manufacturing is closely related to two kinds of flows. One is labor force free flow. The other is commodities or goods materials flow, that is transportations. While this kind of two kinds of flows is in severe shortage of India, like the labor force free flow, because of the rigid labor law, because of the traditional caste system, this kind of flow is not so visible. While for the transportation, because of the backward of infrastructure, the cost of transportation is too highly, especially comparing to China.
Right. Well, is that really also the perspective of the Indian expert? Let's go to Professor Nalapat from Manipal University in India. Mr. Hu in our studio in Beijing say the situation is not likely to change very fast. Professor Nalapat.
Well, in the short run of a few years, yes, that is true. But I'd like to point out that in India we want cheap electricity, and if we want to get cheap electricity, Chinese companies provide the cheapest form of electricity in terms of international competition. We want telecom communications across the hundreds of millions of Indian people. If you want cheap telecom, again you have to go to China. If you want cheap infrastructure internationally, you have to go to China. So there is no question that China will be very helpful to us in enabling our people to have a better life. But I quite agree that the imbalance cannot be at the level it is now. It's nearly $40 billion it's going to be in this financial year. So the way out is, frankly, for China to also provide cheap credit to India, cheap finances to India, and for Chinese tourists to come to India rather than perhaps to other countries. So through these services, through tourism, through finance, to an extent the trade gap can be reduced. But I agree with my old friend that it's not going to be possible to remove the gap because of the huge advantage China has got in manufacturing.
Well, knowing that at the back of the mind, Professor Tao here in Beijing, what do you think can be done to make sure that even though the trade surplus China has against India still exists, might be for quite some time, the two countries can still move forward on many other fronts while being active in negotiations and discussions about this area?
Yes, I think so. China is a world factory, so China exports a lot of commodity to every country in the world, actually. And China makes a lot of trade surplus with the United States and then with Europe. Well, we have some trade surplus with India, but it's not that big. Maybe just 20 billion or something like that. So it's not very meaningful for China. So China does not seek trade surplus deliberately with India. But as Professor Hu just mentioned, this is a structural problem. China exports so many goods, and as Professor Nalapat said, if you want some good and cheap quality, cheap goods, then you go to China. Now, one thing I think is important, because some Indian traders just think about the cost, about how to sell in India. So they sometimes, buy a lot of low quality commodities in China, and that makes China image is not that good. This problem also with Africa, with African countries.
Well, it is not just about the trade. In fact, it is also about many other areas. For example, the people-to-people relations. We understand the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang had tea on Tuesday with one of the most well-known family members in China from India. If I could read her name is Manorama Kotnis. Ms. Kotnis is the younger sister of Dr. Kotnis, who came to China during the 1930s, during the Second World War, and helped China to treat the wounded in the battlefield. And eventually Chinese look at him as one of China's best friends. But we understand so many Chinese top leaders over the past few decades, when they visited India, all visited Ms. Kotnis. However, one might also argue and ask the question, what about the newer friendship that has been built over the past few decades? Mr. Hu, you're an expert in this field. Help us to understand the people-to-people relations between China and India. Is it likely to play a big part in the strategic directions that the two leadership has already described about closer ties?
You know that the bilateral relations now is generally led by or guided by the top leaders. So now the public opinions, we lack that kind of public opinions toward each other. So the basic reason is that the lack of people-to-people contact. The figure shows that last year we have about 80 billion Chinese tourists going abroad, but among them only about 7 lakh 7 lakhs, that is 100,000 between China and India. That is 1 to 6, 1 6. That is only about 100,000 from China to India.
Right.
So very, very few. So how to improve it? That increase the infrastructures, increase the service industries, and also increase the culture-to-culture exchanges. Yeah.
We do see the two governments, at least at this time, thinking very hard about how to do things, how to make it better, because there is a strategic importance that the two countries are having good relationship. But one of the things, Professor Nalaphat, I would really like to pose to you before we close our show today, that is, can the two countries learn from each other's lessons and experiences? Can they be role models for each other? China, for example, opening up and reform. India, for example, which is very proud of its own democracy. Can the two countries learn from each other?
We can certainly learn from each other, but India is very different from China so far as the government is concerned. And my advice to my Chinese friends would be, please avoid the government as much as possible and go directly to the people, go directly to companies, to universities. One thing, for example, my university has been trying very hard to get Chinese students to come and study in our university. But we find Chinese students are very interested in studying in Western countries, and they're not so interested in India. Indian students, of course, are now very interested in going to China and learning Chinese. I think there's a need for a much greater exchange of students. There's a need for much greater exchange of movies, of press releases, and so many other ways of people-to-people contact.
All right.
That's the only way you can have a sustained relationship.
After that advertisement for your university, Professor, let's come back to our Beijing studio. Mr. Hu, can the two countries learn from each other? Are they inspirations for each other? Can they be role models for each other at this moment?
I think it is already become a new type of model for major powers. So because that we have so many differences, but our bilateral relations is generally stable for so many years.
Final words from you.
Well, I think Professor Nalaphat made a very important suggestion, that is to strengthen, to enhance people-to-people exchanges. That probably is a very important point for the further Sino-Indian relationship.
Many in China have been watching Indian movies. Many in China can also recite 1 or 2 pieces of Tagore's poems from India, but certainly that is not enough. That exchange needs to be much increased and go into much more in-depth. We want to thank the 3 of you for coming forward to our program. Professor Nalaphat from India, and also Professor Tao Wenzhao from Beijing, and Mr. Hu Zhisheng here in China as well. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And thank you for watching. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing.